I work for the State Department. Every report from Israel mentions a place that doesn't exist.
The GPS coordinates led us deeper into the Appalachian foothills than I'd expected, past the point where cell service died and the hiking trails turned into deer paths. I kept checking my grandfather's compass pendant, stupid habit since we had actual navigation equipment, but something about these mountains made me want that extra reassurance. "Signal's holding steady," Georgia announced for the third time in 10 minutes, adjusting her receiver like she could fine-tune Stella's location through sheer willpower. She'd been obsessing over the equipment since we left the parking area, double-checking every connection and battery level. I got it. After what happened with her wolf pack in Montana, she needed this research to go perfectly. Pankaj dumped his pack next to a fallen log and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Remind me why we're hiking through Deliverance country to track one bear when there are perfectly good populations near actual roads." "Because Stella's showing unusual movement patterns," Olivia said, not looking up from her satellite printouts. "And this area hasn't been studied since the 1980s. I already knew that. What I didn't mention was that my grandfather had been one of the last people to officially document anything here, back when he was investigating safety violations at the uranium mines. The Park Service files were thin on details about why he'd disappeared, but I'd read them all. Multiple times. Late at night, when I should have been sleeping. The official report used words like presumed deceased and insufficient evidence and case suspended pending new information. Bureaucratic language that meant they'd given up looking for a body. We crested a ridge and the valley opened up below us. Millbrook spread out like a broken toy set, collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, and 3 mine shafts sealed with concrete barriers that looked newer than everything else. The whole place had this dead quality, like the forest had given up trying to reclaim it. Trees grew right up to the edge of the town's perimeter, then stopped abruptly, as if something had drawn an invisible line they refused to cross. Georgia's equipment beeped. "She's about 2 miles southeast of the main structures, still moving, but slowly." "Probably foraging," I said, though something about the bear's location bothered me. Why would she stay in the contaminated zone when there was plenty of food in the cleaner areas? Black bears were opportunistic feeders, smart enough to avoid places that made them sick. Yet Stella had been circling this dead valley for 3 days. "Please tell me we're not camping next to a radioactive ghost town." Pankaj squinted at the ruins. "I'd like to keep all my hair, thanks." "Radiation levels are within acceptable limits," Olivia said quickly. Too quickly. "We'll set up camp here on the ridge. Safe distance, good visibility." I watched her face as she stared at Millbrook. Most people looked at abandoned places with curiosity or mild unease. Olivia looked at it like she was calculating something, running numbers in her head, measuring distances and angles with her eyes. It was the same expression she'd worn when reviewing our research proposal 6 months ago, right before she'd approved funding without asking a single follow-up question. That should have been my first warning sign. We found a clearing that met Georgia's extensive safety requirements: level ground, good drainage, clear sightlines in all directions. She checked for deadfall and widowmakers while Pankaj grumbled about carrying extra gear for someone else's bear paranoia. "Better paranoid than dead," Georgia muttered, testing guideline tension on her tent. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. Montana had done that to her. She'd lost 6 months of data when a grizzly tore Georgia had her sample collection kit spread across a tarp, organizing vials and testing strips with the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb disposal. Every piece of equipment had a specific place, a backup system, and a backup for the backup system. Sterilized containers arranged by size, pH strips in waterproof pouches, specimen bags labeled with dates that hadn't happened yet because Georgia believed in being prepared for every possible scenario. "You know, most bears just eat fish and berries," Pankaj said, watching her work. "They don't require a full hazmat protocol." "Contaminated environment requires contamination protocols," Georgia replied without looking up. "I'm not losing another data set to poor preparation." Her voice carried an edge that suggested the conversation was over. Pankaj caught my eye and shrugged. We'd all learned not to push Georgia when she got like this. The light was fading fast now, turning the ruins below into a collection of dark shapes against darker shadows. I found myself studying the main street, trying to imagine it 40 years ago when my grandfather walked down there with his safety inspection clipboard and radiation detector. In the photos I'd found in his files, Millbrook had been a functional town, small, isolated, but alive. Workers' housing lined the streets. The company store had plate glass windows. Kids played in a yard behind what used to be the school. Now it looked like something from a war zone. Buildings sagging into themselves, rust consuming everything metal. And that weird absence of vegetation inside the town limits, like even the weeds knew better. "Anyone else think it's weird how quiet it is down there?" Pankaj asked. Now that he mentioned it, yeah. No bird sounds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the valley floor. I'd been hiking in these mountains since I was a kid, and there was always noise, always something moving, chirping, digging, hunting. But the silence rising from Millbrook felt thick and deliberate, like the absence of sound was itself a presence. "Mineral contamination affects local wildlife patterns," Olivia said. "Perfectly normal for a former mining site." Normal, right. Except I'd read enough of my grandfather's notes to know that Millbrook had been anything but normal, even before he disappeared. Workers reported equipment malfunctions in the deeper tunnels, compasses spinning uselessly, flashlights dying despite fresh batteries, and the sounds. Scraping, rhythmic scratching coming from shafts that shouldn't have connected to anything. The company had blamed it on radiation exposure causing hallucinations. Classic deflection. We ate dinner from our camping stoves as full darkness settled in. The storm clouds blocked most of the stars, and the valley below disappeared completely, swallowed by shadows that seemed thicker than they should be. Georgia kept checking her equipment readouts. Battery levels, signal strength, GPS accuracy. Everything was working perfectly, which somehow made me more nervous than if something had been malfunctioning. "Early start tomorrow," Olivia announced, banking her stove's flame. "We'll track Stella's current position and see what's keeping her in this area." "Assuming she's still moving," Pankaj said around a mouthful of dehydrated beef stroganoff. "She's been stationary for almost 2 hours now." "Den site, maybe," Georgia suggested, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Female blacks will sometimes establish temporary shelters in areas with consistent food sources." "In a contaminated zone?" I asked. Georgia didn't answer, just went back to checking her equipment. I settled into my sleeping bag and listened to my teammates rustling around in their tents. The thunder had moved off, but the air still felt charged, like the storm might circle back. Through my tent mesh, I could see the faint outline of the ruins below, darker patches against the dark valley floor. Something about this place felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with maps or research papers, like genetic memory passed down from my grandfather through 40 years of family silence. My mother had never wanted to talk about him, changed the subject whenever I asked about his work, his disappearance, why we'd never had a funeral. It was like he'd been erased from family history, edited out of conversations and photo albums. But I'd found his journals in my grandmother's attic after she died. Boxes of them, spanning 30 years of geological surveys and safety inspections. The entries from Millbrook were different from the others, more detailed, more urgent, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky as the dates progressed. He'd known something was wrong here. The last entry was dated 3 days before he vanished. Just one line. It's not protecting the uranium. The uranium is protecting it. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on tomorrow's research objectives, but my hand kept finding that compass pendant. In the distance, so faint I might have imagined it, I thought I heard the echo of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone taking their time, confident they'd reach their destination eventually. I told myself it was just the wind moving debris. Told myself I was letting my grandfather's paranoia infect my perception. I didn't believe either explanation. The sound hit me like ice water at 2:47 a.m. A low, melodic voice drifting up from the valley, singing something that made my skin crawl with recognition. Not because I'd heard the song recently, but because it was familiar the way childhood nightmares are familiar, buried so deep you can't quite place them until they surface at the worst possible moment. I lay there for maybe 30 seconds, hoping it was just my brain playing tricks after a day of thinking too much about my grandfather. But the voice kept going, carrying some old mining ballad through the still air between the ruins below and our ridge camp. The melody rose and fell like breathing, patient and unhurried. Down, down, down in the deep dark ground, where the sun don't shine and the rats are drowned. Dig that rock and haul that load, till the mountain takes what the mountain's owed. A zipper sounded from Pankage's tent, followed by his whispered curse. You hearing this too? Yeah. I crawled out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my flashlight and jacket. My fingers fumbled with the zipper, clumsy with adrenaline. How long has it been going on? 20 minutes, maybe more. Started real quiet, but it's getting louder. Pankage's voice carried the kind of calm that only came from serious military training or serious denial. Probably both. Pankage had his rifle slung over his shoulder when he emerged from his tent. The guy who'd been making jokes about Deliverance Country all day suddenly wasn't taking any chances. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, but the singing made everything feel wrong, like we were trespassing on something private and dangerous. Should we wake the others? I asked, though I already knew the answer from his expression. And tell them what? That we're spooked by some drunk local wandering around a ghost town? He adjusted his grip on the rifle. Let's just check it out. Probably nothing. But his knuckles were white on the stock, and he kept the safety off. That told me everything about how much he believed his own reassurance. We made our way down through the trees, trying to step carefully on the uneven ground. The singing got clearer as we moved closer to Millbrook's main street. Definitely a male voice, gravelly and rough, like someone who'd spent too many years breathing dust and cigarette smoke. The melody was one of those old worker songs, the kind my grandfather used to hum while he worked in his garage. That connection hit me harder than it should have. Grandpa had hummed constantly, usually stuff from his mining days, but I'd never paid close attention to the actual songs. My mother had hated it, would leave the room whenever he started up. I'd always thought she just found it annoying, but now I wondered if she'd recognized something in those melodies that I'd been too young to understand. Now, hearing something similar floating up from the place where he'd disappeared, I felt this weird vertigo, like the past 40 years had collapsed into nothing. Like time was a circle, and I was about to complete a revolution someone else had started. The ruins looked different at night. During the day, they'd seemed sad and abandoned, the way old buildings do when people stop caring about them. Now they looked actively hostile, full of shadows that moved wrong and angles that hurt to look at directly. The moonlight created pockets of visibility surrounded by darkness so complete it seemed solid, like you could reach out and touch it. We crept along what used to be the main street, staying close to the broken sidewalk where our footsteps wouldn't echo on gravel. The singing was coming from near the old company store, a building that had lost most of its roof but still had walls standing, defiant against decades of weather. The mountain gives and the mountain takes, every soul that the deep shaft makes. Some go down and don't come back, lost forever in the endless black. Through the moonlight, I could make out a figure standing with his back to us, wearing what looked like a miner's helmet with a light that wasn't turned on. He had on coveralls and heavy boots, and he was swaying slightly as he sang, like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. His movements had a rhythmic quality that felt practiced, ritualistic even. Pankaj pointed toward a pile of rubble we could crouch behind, maybe 20 feet away from the figure. We made it without making noise, picking our way over broken concrete and twisted rebar. But then, Pankaj's boot came down on a branch that snapped like a gunshot. The singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been, complete and heavy, like the whole valley was holding its breath. Even the wind died. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs, could hear Pankaj breathing too fast beside me. The figure slowly turned toward us, moving with this deliberate calm that was absolutely terrifying. Most people, if startled, would spin around quickly, defensively. This guy turned like he had all the time in the world, like he'd been expecting us and was just confirming what he already knew. When his face caught the moonlight, I understood why Pankaj's hand had tightened on his rifle. The guy was gaunt to the point of looking sick, with hollow cheeks and skin that seemed too tight over his skull. But his eyes were the worst part. They reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, throwing back this pale, silvery light that made him look more like a nocturnal predator than a person. Not red like deer or green like raccoons, but silver-white, like light reflecting off mercury. He stared at us for maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like hours. There was something about his face that bothered me beyond just the general creepiness, something familiar that I couldn't quite identify. The bone structure maybe, or the way he held his head slightly tilted to the left, like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. It reminded me of someone. The thought was there, hovering just out of reach. Pankaj raised the rifle, not quite pointing it, but making it clear he was ready to. "Evening," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Didn't mean to interrupt. We're just researchers from the university, tracking wildlife in the area." The figure watched this happen with no expression at all. Didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge that a weapon was being aimed in his general direction. Just stared with those mercury eyes that seemed to drink in the moonlight and give nothing back. Then he simply stepped backward into the shadows between the buildings. 1 second he was there, solid and visible in the moonlight. The next he was gone, like he'd never existed. Not quickly. There was no running or scrambling for cover. He just took one deliberate step backward, and the darkness swallowed him completely. We waited behind that rubble pile for 10 minutes, listening for footsteps or voices or any sign that he was still around. Nothing. Even the normal night sounds seemed muted, like the forest was afraid to make noise. I found myself counting my own breaths, trying to slow my racing heart. "Think he's gone?" Pankaj whispered finally. "I have no idea." We made our way back to camp without talking, both of us jumping at every shadow and sound. Pankaj kept the rifle ready, sweeping it across our path like we were on patrol in hostile territory. Maybe we were. Only when we were back in the safety of our tent cluster did he lower the weapon, clicking the safety back on with hands that shook slightly. "That was not a drunk local," he said quietly. "No kidding." I wanted to ask if the guy had looked familiar to him too, but that seemed like the kind of question that would make me sound crazy. "Hey, did that nightmare person with the reflective eyes remind you of anyone we know?" Yeah, great conversation starter. Instead, I just said goodnight and crawled back into my tent, though I knew sleep wasn't happening anytime soon. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, trying to figure out why that face had seemed so familiar. The singing had definitely reminded me of my grandfather, not just the songs he'd hummed, but his actual voice. That same gravelly quality, worn down by years of breathing bad air. But this was something more specific, like I'd seen that exact person before. I pulled out my phone, using what little battery I had left to scroll through photos I'd saved of my grandfather. There was one from 1981, taken at some mining conference. He stood in a group of men wearing coveralls and hard hats, all of them squinting against bright sun. I zoomed in on his face, studying the bone structure, the way he held his head. My blood went cold. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was there. Same general features, same build, same slight tilt of the head. The man in the ruins looked like my grandfather might have looked if he'd spent 40 years underground, slowly being consumed by whatever was wrong with this place. I closed my phone and lay there in the dark, listening to the silence outside my tent. No footsteps now, no singing, just that heavy, expectant quiet that made me feel like something was waiting.
When morning came and Georgia started her usual equipment checks while Olivia studied the weather forecast, neither Pankaj nor I mentioned our midnight encounter. What were we supposed to say? That we'd seen some creepy guy wandering around the ruins, singing old mining songs and disappearing into shadows like a ghost? That he'd looked like my grandfather's corpse might look after 40 years of slow decay? Yeah, that would go over real well with our scientific expedition leaders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that was, he'd been expecting us. Not just expecting people in general, but us specifically. Like we'd walked into a trap that had been set decades ago, and we were right on schedule. Dawn came gray and cold, with that heavy feeling you get when storms are still deciding whether to stick around or move on. Crawled out of my tent, feeling like I'd maybe slept 2 hours total, which was probably optimistic. Every time I'd started to drift off, I'd jerked awake, certain I'd heard singing from the valley. Pankaj emerged from his tent looking equally rough, and we exchanged one of those looks that said everything without saying anything. His eyes were bloodshot, and he'd clearly spent the night in the same state of hypervigilant half-sleep. Georgia was already up, of course, running through her morning equipment check with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd been awake for a while. "Signal still holding," she announced, though something in her voice made me look up from lacing my boots. "Still stationary?" asked. "For the last 6 hours." "Exactly." She frowned at her receiver display. Tapping it like that might change the reading. Either the collars malfunctioned, or she didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what she meant. Bears didn't typically stay in one spot for 6 hours unless they were sick, injured, or dead. Olivia packed her gear with efficient movements, already dressed and ready to go. "We'll know soon enough whether it's holding, so we should get moving." We followed her southeast through terrain that felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. The trees looked stunted, their leaves a sickly yellow-green that didn't match the season. Even the undergrowth seemed sparse and brittle, like the soil couldn't support normal growth patterns. When I knelt to examine a patch of moss, it crumbled under my fingers, dry and lifeless despite the recent rains. Mineral contamination, Olivia said when Pankage commented on the vegetation. The runoff from the mining operations affected everything downstream. That made sense scientifically, but it didn't explain why the whole area felt hostile, like we were walking through something that actively wanted us gone. The air had a metallic taste that coated my tongue. My compass pendant kept spinning lazily, unable to find north, as if the magnetic field itself was corrupted here. 2 hours in, Georgia stopped so suddenly that I almost walked into her. Holy shit. She was staring at a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred with claw marks that started about 8 feet up and ran down to the ground in deep parallel gouges. Each mark was easily 3 inches wide and carved so deep into the wood that sap was still bleeding from the wounds, sticky and dark like molasses. Pankage circled the tree, rifle in hand. Black bears don't get that high, okay? And they sure as hell don't have claws this big. I ran my fingers along one of the gouges. The wood felt warm, almost feverish, and there was this smell like burnt metal that made my nose itch. The claw marks weren't random scratching. They had a pattern, deliberate, evenly spaced, like whatever made them had been measuring something. Grisly territory, Georgia suggested weakly. Not in these mountains, Olivia said, though she was photographing the marks with a kind of focus that suggested she wasn't entirely surprised. Not for over a century. We found 3 more trees with similar damage over the next half-mile. Each set of marks larger and more violent than the last. The final tree looked like it had been attacked with industrial equipment and tire sections of bark stripped away. The inner wood gouged so deeply you could see the tree's rings, counting back decades of growth that had been violated in minutes. George's equipment was going crazy now, beeping constantly as we got closer to whatever was waiting for us. Electromagnetic interference is off the charts, she muttered, adjusting her sensors. This doesn't make sense. We should be getting weaker signals the further we get from. That's when Pankage found the blood. Started as scattered drops on the leaves, dark and thick enough to still look wet despite the morning dew. The trail led us through a gap between 2 massive boulders into a clearing that made my stomach drop the second I saw it. Stella's remains were spread across 40 feet of open ground in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Legs here, torso there, head positioned at the far edge like someone had arranged everything according to some sick blueprint. The GPS collar lay in twisted fragments near what used to be her neck, crushed so thoroughly that the metal looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. This isn't right, Georgia whispered, pulling on latex gloves with hands that shook so badly she could barely get them on. Predators don't feel like this. She was right. I had seen bear kills before, and they were messy but practical. Bears ate what they needed and left the rest. Looked surgical, like something had taken Stella apart, piece by piece with medical precision. Each section of her body was positioned at exact distances from the others. When I looked at it from above standing on one of the boulders, I could see it formed a geometric pattern. Not random, intentional. The trees around the clearing showed those same claw marks we'd seen earlier, but worse. Black streaks running down the bark like lightning burns, except they went upward instead of down, as if something had climbed up from the ground, carrying heat or energy. The soil had that metallic smell again, sharp and chemical in a way that reminded me of my grandfather's old Geiger counter when he let me play with it as a kid. Pankage was studying the ground near the largest piece of the carcass. Work boots, size 10 or 11, distinctive tread pattern. My skin went cold. Leading which direction? Toward Millbrook. He followed the prints to the edge of the clearing where they disappeared onto rocky ground. Whoever it was, they were here recently. Maybe last night. I stared at those boot prints and felt something click into place in my brain. The singing man from last night, standing in the ruins, in his coveralls and heavy boots. Either he'd witnessed whatever did this to Stella, or he'd done it himself. Neither option made me feel any better about our situation. But a human couldn't have done this, couldn't have torn apart a 400-pound bear and arranged to pieces with geometric precision. Couldn't have crushed a metal GPS collar into fragments with their bare hands, lest they weren't entirely human anymore. Georgia managed to collect tissue samples despite her shaking hands, sealing them in sterile containers with the methodical precision that had kept her sane the worst disasters. Olivia photographed everything from multiple angles, maintaining scientific protocol, even though I could see the strain around her eyes, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder at the trees. "We need to get back to camp," she said, finally, checking her watch. "Process what we found and decide how to proceed." "Proceed?" Pankage stared at her. "We need to get the fuck out of here. Contact the authorities, report this, and let people with actual weapons and hazmat gear deal with whatever's happening. We don't have the full picture yet," Olivia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We have a dead bear, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist, and evidence that someone was watching it happen. That's enough picture for me." As we packed up the evidence, I couldn't stop thinking about those work boot prints and the way that singing man had looked at us in the moonlight. Like he'd been expecting us to show up, like he knew exactly what we were going to find. Like this was all part of some script written 40 years ago, and we were just actors playing our assigned roles. The walk back to camp felt longer than the journey out. We kept to open ground where we could see in all directions, rifles ready, every shadow a potential threat. The forest seemed to watch us with hostile attention, and I realized we'd crossed some invisible threshold. We weren't scientists conducting research anymore. We were prey. That night, I tried to focus on organizing my field notes, anything to keep my brain occupied while we waited for whatever came next. But the words swam on the page, and I kept seeing Stella's remains arranged in that geometric pattern, kept hearing that gravelly voice singing about mountains taking what they're owned. Olivia sat at the edge of camp, studying topographical maps, but I caught her glancing toward Millbrook every few minutes, like she was expecting something. Sun had set an hour ago, and the valley below was a pool of absolute darkness. No light pollution out here to soften the night. Pankage cleaned his rifle for the third time since dinner, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. The familiar mechanical actions seemed to center him, give him something concrete to focus on. "What do you know about this place that you're not telling us?" I asked Olivia finally. She looked up from her maps, and for a moment I thought she might deflect again. Then she sighed, the kind of long exhale that came before difficult admissions. "I've been researching Millbrook's history," she said slowly. "The mining operations, the uranium extraction, why they shut everything down so suddenly." Georgia stopped organizing her vials for the first time in 20 minutes. "You've been researching it since when?" "Since before we got here." Olivia folded her map with precise movements. "The official records say they closed the mines in 1983 due to depleted ore, reserves, and environmental concerns. But the geological surveys from the 1970s showed significant untapped deposits. They abandoned billions of dollars worth of uranium for reasons that don't appear in any public documentation." Pankage leaned forward, rifle forgotten across his lap. "So what really happened?" "Workers started reporting unusual incidents, equipment malfunctions, strange sounds from the deeper tunnels, animals behaving aggressively near the mine entrances." Olivia's voice carried the tone of someone reciting facts they wished weren't true. 3 miners disappeared completely. The company blamed it on cave-ins, but search teams never found any bodies or evidence of structural collapse. My skin felt cold despite the warmth from the camping stove. "When did the disappearances happen?" "Between 1982 and 1983. The last one was a safety inspector name." She consulted her notes, though I suspected she'd memorized this information long ago. Hiroshi Sanders. The compass slipped from my fingers and hit the ground with a metallic clink. Hiroshi Sanders. My grandfather's name. Kazuki. George's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Are you okay? I picked up the compass, trying to keep my hand steady. That was my grandfather. He disappeared investigating these mines 40 years ago. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications none of us wanted to voice. Finally, Olivia nodded, like she'd been expecting this revelation, like she'd been waiting to see how long it would take me to figure it out. That's why you're here, she said, quietly, not just for the bare research. You've been looking for answers about your family. Maybe. I met her eyes, and maybe that's why you picked this location. You knew about the connection. She didn't deny it, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd been hiding from us. The research proposal, the specific coordinates, the insistence on this particular study, sight none of it, had been random. We've been guided here, manipulated into position, like pieces on a game board. Look, Pankaj said, breaking the tension. Family mysteries aside, we need to make a decision. Stay and risk ending up like Stella, or get out while we still can. The nearest road is a day's hike, Olivia pointed out, a T, and it's already dark. Moving at night through unfamiliar territory would be more dangerous than waiting for morning. More dangerous than whatever tore apart a 400-pound bear. George's voice was rising toward panic. I don't think that's mathematically possible. Before anyone could respond, a sound drifted up from the valley. Not singing this time. Scraping, metal, on stone, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, echoing off the mountain walls. We all froze, listening. The scraping continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps, multiple sets, heavy boots on gravel, moving through Millbrook's main street. How many people are down there? Georgia whispered. Pankaj had his rifle up, staring toward the valley through his night vision scope. I count, 3, maybe 4 figures, moving between buildings. They're not trying to hide. Can you see what they look like? I asked. Too dark, even with night vision, but their movement pattern is strange. Too coordinated, like they're searching for something, or guarding something. I thought, but didn't say. We watched the valley for an hour, taking turns with a night vision scope. The figures moved methodically through the ruins, appearing and disappearing between buildings. Sometimes they'd stop for long minutes, perfectly still, like they were listening. Then they'd resume their patrol patterns. We should go down there, I said finally. Everyone looked at me like I'd suggested we jump off a cliff into the mines. I clarified. Tomorrow, whatever's happening, the answers are down there. Are you completely insane? Georgia stared at me. A place is contaminated. We don't have proper protective gear, for Bill says. Something's down there. Something that killed Stella. I pulled out my grandfather's compass, watching the needle swing erratically in directions that had nothing to do with magnetic north. We need to know what we're dealing with. Pankaj set down his rifle and stared at me like I'd suggested we juggle live grenades. The crazy mining guy who appears and disappears like a ghost told us to leave, and your response is to go exploring radioactive tunnels. That's your plan. It's not about Bill, though honestly, the way he talked about my grandfather was eating at me. Some people get absorbed by it, he'd said. What the hell did that mean? We're scientists. We don't run away from contaminated sites. We study them, figure out what's wrong, and document our findings. We're wildlife biologists, Georgia corrected. Not miners or radiation specialists, or paranormal investigators, or whatever, the situation requires. Olivia had been quiet this whole time, studying her topographical maps with that calculating expression I was learning to recognize. Finally, she looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes That might have been resignation, might have been relief that someone else had finally suggested what she'd been planning all along. "I've been researching the mine system," she said slowly. "The layout, the depth of the shafts, the areas they were actively working when operations ceased." Georgia stopped mid-protest. "You've been researching it since when?" "Since before we got here." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Olivia unfolded one of her maps, and I saw it wasn't a topographical survey of the surrounding wilderness. It was a schematic of the mine system hand-drawn, detailed, with notes in the margins about tunnel depths, support structure conditions, and radiation readings. "Where did you get this?" Pankaj asked quietly. "It's from the same source that got me access to the closed Park Service files." Olivia's voice was steady, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "It's the same source that suggested this location for our research in the first place." "You've been lying to us from the start," Georgia said. "This whole expedition, the bear tracking, the research proposal, it was all cover for something else." "Not lying." Omitting double quotes, Olivia met each of our eyes in turn. "I was told that bringing a team would be safer than going alone. That having legitimate research credentials would prevent too many questions if something went wrong." "Told? By who?" I demanded. "By someone who's been monitoring this site for 40 years. Someone who reaches out occasionally to recruit people willing to investigate what really happened here." She paused. "Someone who used to work with your grandfather, Kazuki." My blood went cold. "Bill. His real name is Patricio Duran. He was the chief safety officer at Millbrook when the mines closed. He's been living in the area ever since, keeping watch, trying to prevent what happened to him from happening to others." "What did happen to him?" Pankaj asked. Olivia pulled out a folder I'd never seen before, extracting a photo that looked like it had been taken in the 1980s. It showed a man in his 30s, healthy and normal looking, standing in front of the mine entrance. He had dark hair, strong features, and a smile that suggested he didn't know what was coming. The resemblance to the figure we'd seen last night was there, but only in the bone structure. Everything else had been hollowed out, corrupted, changed by 40 years of exposure to whatever was wrong with this place. "He was in the deepest shaft when they discovered the anomaly," Olivia continued. "Some kind of chamber that shouldn't have existed, containing elements that didn't match any known geological formation. The radiation levels were extreme, but not in patterns consistent with uranium decay." "What kind of patterns?" Card scientific curiosity, temporarily overriding her fear. "Purposeful ones. Like the radiation was being directed, focused, used for something." Olivia pulled out more document scan results. Chemical analyses, chemical breakdowns of samples that defied categorization. "Key, Bill and your grandfather, Kazuki. They were trying to document what they'd found when the company ordered an immediate evacuation. Sealed the mines within 72 hours. Anyone who'd been in the deep shafts, anyone who'd seen the chamber, they all disappeared, reassigned to other facilities, paid off, or, in some cases, just gone." "Except Bill," I said. "Except Bill. He refused to leave. Knew something was down there that needed watching." "Your grandfather was supposed to leave too. Was ordered back to the main office in Atlanta. But he came back 3 days later. Said he needed to retrieve something from the mine. Never came out. The pieces were clicking into place now, forming a picture I really didn't want to see. Ville's been guarding this place ever since. Living here, changing slowly, becoming whatever that radiation does to people over time, and recruiting others to help," Olivia confirmed. "People who might be able to figure out what's really happening. What's growing stronger down there instead of weaker. The concrete barriers have gaps," she said, surprising all of us. "Erosion from 40 years of weather. The entrance to the main shaft is accessible if you know where to look." Georgia stared at her. "You've been down there already. Preliminary survey only. Radiation levels are elevated but not immediately lethal with limited exposure." Olivia's matter-of-fact delivery made it sound like she was discussing weather patterns. "We'd need to limit our time underground and monitor exposure carefully. But it's possible to reach the upper chambers where most of the equipment was left behind. "This is insane," Pankwitch muttered. But he was already checking his equipment, accepting the inevitable with the resignation of someone who'd been in bad situations before and knew that sometimes the only way out was through. We spent the rest of the evening planning the descent. Georgia compiled every piece of detection equipment. We had radiation monitors, electromagnetic sensors, air quality meters. She worked with grim efficiency, no longer trying to argue against the plan, but throwing herself into preparation like she had before Montana. Before Marcus disappeared and taught her that perfect preparation couldn't prevent every disaster. Pond Cage insisted on bringing his rifle, despite my pointing out that bullets wouldn't do much good against radioactive contamination. "Maybe not," he said, cleaning the barrel for the 4th time. "But after seeing what happened to Stella, I'm not going anywhere without firepower." I couldn't argue with that logic. Whatever had torn apart a 400-pound bear and arranged to pieces like art might not be stopped by conventional weapons. But having them was better than going into the dark unarmed. Olivia spread her mind schematics across the tarp, using her flashlight to illuminate the hand-drawn passages and chambers. The main shaft descends at a 15-degree angle for approximately 300 meters before branching into multiple corridors. Most of the uranium extraction happened in the upper levels, but the anomaly the chamber they found was deeper. 700 meters down, in a section that shouldn't have existed, according to the original geological surveys. Shouldn't have existed how? I asked. The mountain's geological composition changes at around 500 meters. The rock becomes too hard for conventional mining equipment from the early 1980s to penetrate effectively, but somehow they broke through into a cavity that showed signs of artificial construction. "Artificial," Georgia repeated slowly. "Mean someone dug it?" "Or something," Olivia said. The walls showed tool marks that didn't match any known mining technique. The chamber was carved from solid granite with precision that would have required modern laser cutting technology, except it was done thousands of years ago, based on the sediment analysis. The implications sat heavy between us. We were talking about descending into a mine that had breached some kind of ancient chamber, discovering something that had been deliberately buried and protected by naturally occurring radiation. Something that had been waiting underground for thousands of years until humans were stupid enough to dig deep enough to find it. "What did they find in the chamber?" Pankage asked quietly. Olivia hesitated, and I saw real fear in her eyes for the first time since we'd arrived. Bill's reports weren't clear on the details. He mentioned symbols carved into the walls, geometric patterns that seemed to shift depending on the light angle, equipment malfunctions, capacitors spinning, flashlights dying, radios picking up sounds that shouldn't be possible. Something he described as presence, not an object or a creature, but an awareness, like they'd woken something up. I thought about the figures we'd seen patrolling Millbrook streets, the coordinated way they moved. My grandfather went down there 3 days before he disappeared, trying to retrieve something. His research, Olivia confirmed. He'd been documenting everything: measurements, photographs, sample analysis. The company wanted it all destroyed, but he refused. Said the world needed to know what was down there. So he died trying to blow the whistle on something that should have stayed buried, Pankage said. That's comforting. We don't know that he died, I said, though I wasn't sure why I was clinging to that possibility. The alternative that he was still down there somehow, absorbed by whatever presence inhabited the deep chamber, was worse. We tried to sleep after that, but I don't think any of us managed more than a few hours. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds, or rather, the absence of them. The valley below remained silent, but I could feel a tension pressing against our camp like atmospheric pressure before a storm. At some point, I must have drifted off, 'cause I jerked awake to pale gray light filtering through my tent and George's voice outside, tight with fear. The collar signals back. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, nearly tripping over my boots in my hurry to get outside. Georgia stood in the middle of camp, her receiver held like it might bite her, staring at the display with an expression somewhere between confusion and terror. "Stella's collar?" asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's transmitting again. Strong signal, less than half a mile from our position." She turned the receiver, tracking the direction, coming from Millbrook. From inside the sealed mine shaft, we all stared toward the valley, where morning mist clung to the ruins like grave shrouds. "Not possible," Pankage said. "We saw what was left of her. The collar was destroyed. Electromagnetic interference can cause false signals," Olivia suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Residual energy from the mines could be creating ghost readings." Georgia shook her head, adjusting her equipment. "This is a live transmission, real-time GPS coordinates and biometric data. According to this, Stella's alive, conscious, and moving through the upper mine tunnels. Or something wants us to think she is," I said quietly. We looked at each other, understanding passing between us without words. This was an invitation. A lure. Whatever was down there in the darkness had taken Stella's collar and reactivated it, creating a signal it knew we'd follow. It wanted us to come down. The question was whether we were desperate enough or stupid enough to accept the invitation. Olivia was already packing her gear, checking her flashlight batteries and radiation monitor. "The entrance is unstable. Okay, we go now while we have daylight to get back if we need to evacuate quickly." "When we need to evacuate," Pankage corrected, but he was loading extra ammunition into his pack. Georgia stood frozen, staring at her receiver like it held the answer to some question she hadn't asked yet. Then she methodically began checking her sample collection equipment, her movements jerky but determined. "This is a bad idea," she said. "This is such a profoundly, catastrophically bad idea that there aren't words sufficient to describe how bad it is." "You're not wrong," Pankage agreed. "But I'm doing it anyway," she continued, "'cause I need to know. After Montana, after Marcus, I need to know what's really out there that we've been pretending doesn't exist." I understood exactly what she meant. We'd all felt it at some point in our careers, that sense that the natural world contained things our textbooks and training hadn't prepared us for. Patterns that shouldn't exist, behaviors that defied explanation. The scientific establishment dismissed these anomalies as observer error or data contamination, but we knew better. We'd been collecting the edges of a truth our entire professional lives. Now we had a chance to see its center, even if that truth was something terrible. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with storm clouds building on the horizon. We made our way down to Millbrook's Main Street in silence, each of us carrying equipment and private fears. The ruins looked no better in daylight. If anything, the sunshine made the decay more obvious, highlighting rust and rot and the unnatural absence of life. Following Olivia to the largest of the sealed mine entrances, we could see what she'd meant about erosion. The concrete barrier looked solid from a distance, but up close I could see the gaps she'd mentioned, places where decades of freeze-thaw cycles had cracked the cement, creating openings just wide enough for a person to crawl through if they were determined enough or stupid enough. "Radiation levels are elevated, but manageable," Georgia announced, checking her detector. The clicking was audible, but not frantic. "We should limit exposure to 30 minutes maximum." Olivia went first, squeezing through the largest gap with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. I followed, and the temperature dropped about 20 degrees the moment I passed through the barrier. The air had a different quality, heavier, thicker, like breathing through damp wool. The main tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, supported by rotting timber posts that looked like they might collapse if you looked at them wrong. Our flashlight beams revealed rail tracks disappearing into the black. Rusted equipment left exactly where workers had dropped it 40 years ago. At walls that glistened with moisture that felt wrong somehow, too viscous to be ordinary water. "Jesus," Pankage whispered behind me. "How deep does this go?" The original survey maps show the main shaft extending almost 2 miles into the mountain, Olivia said, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Multiple levels with connecting tunnels and equipment chambers. George's electromagnetic sensor was beeping constantly now, picking up readings that made her frown at the display. This is weird. I'm getting massive electromagnetic interference, but it's not consistent with standard radioactive decay patterns. It's more like, I don't know, organized noise. There's a rhythm to it. We'd gone maybe 50 yards when I spotted something that made me stop dead. Sitting on a wooden crate beside the tracks was an old Geiger counter, its yellow metal case dented and scratched, but still intact. The design was vintage manual dials, analog readouts, none of the digital equipment we used now. Holy shit. I picked it up carefully, recognizing the model from pictures in my grandfather's papers. The needle jumped immediately to the red zone, clicking rapidly in that familiar sound that meant danger. My hands started shaking before I even saw what I was looking for. That's vintage equipment, Olivia observed. Has to be at least 40 years old. I turned the device over and found what I was looking for, a piece of masking. K, with H. Sanders, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, still legible after 4 decades in this toxic environment. My hands started shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. It was here, I said, my voice barely audible over the Geiger counter's clicking. My grandfather was in this exact spot. The implications hit me like a physical blow. 40 years ago, my grandfather had walked into these tunnels carrying this same device, investigating this same contamination we were documenting now. He'd stood in this exact location, taking readings, making notes, probably humming one of those mining ballads while he worked. But according to the Geiger counter's readings, the radiation levels hadn't decreased like they should have after 4 decades. If anything, they seemed to be getting stronger the deeper we went, like something was feeding the contamination, using it for fuel or protection, or both. Guys, Pankage called from ahead where he'd been scouting the tunnel. You need to see this. We found him standing beside a side chamber that had been carved out of the rock, our flashlights illuminating details I immediately wished I hadn't seen. Someone had been living down here recently. Empty food, cans, modern brands, recent expiration dates, makeshift bedrolls spread across broken pallets, personal items scattered around like a campsite, a camping stove that looked like it had been used within the last few days, and on the wall, carved into the stone with something sharp, a calendar, its tally marks counting days, arranged in groups of 5, stretching across the entire wall in rows that must have represented years. Bill's been living down here, I said, the pieces clicking into place. That's why he knows so much about what's happening. It's not just watching from the outside. It's been staying right here in the contaminated zone. Georgia was taking readings with her equipment, her face pale in the flashlight glow. Radiation levels in this chamber are off the charts. No one could survive extended exposure to this much contamination. Not for days, let alone years, unless they'd already been changed by it, Olivia said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. We stood there, processing that horrifying possibility that Bill had been down here for 40 years, slowly being transformed by the radiation and whatever presence inhabited the deeper chambers. That the figure we'd seen singing in the moonlight was what happened to humans who stayed too long in proximity to something that shouldn't exist. That my grandfather might have undergone the same transformation. George's electromagnetic sensor started going crazy, peeping so rapidly it sounded like an alarm. She held it up, following the signal deeper into the chamber, toward a tunnel entrance we hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a pile of broken equipment. The readings are coming from down there, she whispered. Whatever's causing the electromagnetic interference, it's deeper in the mine, stronger than anything I've measured so far. That's when we heard the scratching. It started as a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails on stone, echoing up from the darker tunnels below. But as we listened, it got louder and more rhythmic, like something large was moving through the passages with deliberate purpose. Not the random scratching of an animal, but measured, purposeful. Like someone dragging something heavy across stone in a pattern they'd repeated so many times it had become automatic. "It's time to go," Pankaj said, raising his rifle. We didn't argue. The four of us backed out of the chamber, then half ran, half stumbled through the main tunnel toward the entrance, my grandfather's Geiger counter-clicking frantically the entire way. The scratching sound followed us, staying just at the edge of our hearing, but never getting closer. Like whatever was making, it wanted us to know it was there, wanted us to understand we were being allowed to leave. When we finally squeezed through the concrete barrier and emerged into daylight, all of us were breathing hard and sweating, despite the cool air. Georgia immediately checked our radiation exposure levels, while Pankaj kept his rifle trained on the mine entrance. As if bullets could stop whatever was moving in those tunnels. Exposure was within acceptable limits, Georgia announced, though her voice shook slightly. But those electromagnetic readings were unlike anything I've ever seen. Whatever's down there, it's not just radioactive contamination. I stared at the Geiger counter in my hands, my grandfather's handwriting still visible on the faded tape. The needle had finally dropped back to normal levels now that we were outside, but the damage was done. I'd found proof that he'd been here in this exact spot, investigating the same mysteries that had drawn us to Millbrook. The question was, what had happened to him after he'd left this device behind? Olivia said, checking her watch. Process what we found and decide our next steps. As we walked back toward the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the mine entrance. Not Bill this time, something else. Something that had been waiting in the deeper tunnels for 40 years. Growing stronger instead of weaker, feeding on whatever corruption had been disturbed when the miners dug too deep. And based on what we'd just seen, I was starting to think my grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He'd been absorbed by it, just like Bill had said. Changed, incorporated, made into something that stood on the boundary between human and other. Singing mining ballads in the darkness and keeping watch over secrets that should have stayed buried. The only question was whether the same thing was going to happen to us. The story continues with Pankaj's death, the escape attempt, Bill's rescue, and eventually the revelation about the narrator's family history and connection to Millbrook. 3 weeks after Millbrook, I finally worked up the courage to visit my grandmother's house. It's a place where I had grown up after my parents died, where my grandfather's things had sat untouched in the basement for 40 years, like a shrine to unfinished business. My grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me the house and everything in it. I'd been meaning to clean out the basement forever, but there had always been some excuse work, research projects, anything to avoid dealing with family ghosts. Now I needed answers, more than I needed to avoid painful memories. The basement smelled like old wood and mothballs and something chemical I couldn't identify, but that reminded me of the mine tunnels. My grandfather's workshop occupied one corner, hand tools organized by size and function, everything exactly where he'd left it 4 decades ago. Even his coffee cup still sat on the workbench, a ring of ancient stains marking where he'd set it down for the last time. But it was the filing cabinet in the back corner that made my heart stop. 3 drawers full of journals, notebooks, and loose papers, all in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I pulled them out one by one, spreading them across the workshop floor in chronological order, creating a timeline of obsession that stretched back further than I'd expected. Maps of Millbrook from before the mines closed, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Radiation readings that matched what we'd found during our expedition. Chemical analyses of soil samples showing elements that shouldn't exist in nature. Photographs of symbols carved into stone, the same geometric patterns Olivia had mentioned from the deep chamber. And stories, dozens of them, handwritten accounts dating back generations. My great-grandfather's notes about miners who'd gone missing in the 1940s. During the earlier attempts to extract uranium for the war effort, his handwriting was shakier than my grandfather's, his English less formal, but the content was chillingly familiar. Workers disappearing from the deeper shafts, equipment malfunctioning, sounds from below that couldn't be explained. In that same sense of presence, something aware, something waiting. Stories from the 1920s about things that shouldn't be disturbing construction. Crews when they first started exploring the mountain. Prospectors who'd found the cave system and fled. Talking about symbols carved by no human hand and a feeling of being watched by something that existed before memory. Even older accounts, some written in Japanese characters I couldn't read, but somehow understood the meaning of warnings about sleeping things beneath mountains, about places where the earth itself was hungry. Stories that went back to when my family first came to America in the late 1800s, brought here by something more purposeful than simple immigration. The pattern went back over a century, okay? My family hadn't just stumbled onto Millbrook by accident. We'd been connected to it for generations, drawn back to the same cursed ground like iron filings to a magnet. We'd all known on some level what we were walking into. Each generation had sent someone, not always voluntarily, but inevitably. My great-great-grandfather had worked the early mining operations. His son had died in a tunnel collapse that search teams could never find evidence of. My great-grandfather had served as a surveyor, mapping the caves before modern equipment existed. My grandfather had been the safety inspector who'd documented what they'd found in the deep chamber. And now me. The final journal entry, dated 3 days before my grandfather's disappearance, was written in English, his handwriting more cramped than usual, as if he'd been writing quickly or under stress. The radiation levels are consistent with geological surveys, but the source is wrong. This isn't natural uranium decades protecting something that's been sleeping beneath the mountain since before recorded history. The miners have awakened it with their deep excavations, and now it's learning about us, studying our patterns and behaviors the way we might study bacteria under a microscope. I understand now why my father and grandfather came here before me. We're connected to this place in ways I can't fully explain, but the family stories make sense. The oldest accounts, the ones written in Japanese that I was never supposed to read, they talk about a bargain made generations ago. Protection in exchange for vigilance. Safety in exchange for witnesses who would watch and record and warn, but never truly stop what was happening. Something calls to us, generation after generation, drawing us back to serve as what? Witnesses, guardians, food. I think I finally understand what the symbols in the deep chamber mean. They're not a warning, they're an invitation. Okay? Door that was meant to be opened eventually when the right conditions aligned. When enough radiation had accumulated to wake what was sleeping. When humans had developed a technology to document what happened next. The thing beneath doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to be understood, studied, acknowledged. It's been alone in the dark for so long that it's forgotten what it was before it went to sleep. It needs us to remember for it, to piece together its history from the fragments it's left behind. But the price of that understanding is terrible, Bill knows. He's chosen to stay, to become part of it gradually, maintaining enough humanity to serve as an interface between worlds. He says, it's not so bad after you accept what you're becoming, okay? That the transformation brings its own kind of clarity. If I don't return from tomorrow's survey, know that I chose to go anyway. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they call to us anyway. Maybe that's our role to answer when they call, to feed the thing beneath so it doesn't grow hungry enough to hunt beyond the mountain. Or maybe we're meant to document its awakening, to leave records for whatever comes after. The compass will always point toward Millbrook. It's been in our family for generations, passed down from father to son, and it will draw you there eventually, just like it drew me. When that happens, remember that courage and stupidity look identical from the outside. Remember that I loved you, even though we never got to know each other properly. Remember that some sacrifices are chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost. Remember that the thing beneath is not evil, just ancient and hungry and lonely. Doesn't understand human concepts like mercy or cruelty. It only understands observation and incorporation in the slow accumulation of knowledge across geological time. When you come, you will come, because the compass won't let you do otherwise. Bring others who can witness and document. The thing beneath prefers to be studied by multiple perspectives. It learns faster that way. Tell your mother I'm sorry. Tell her I understood why she wanted to break the family connection to this place, why she never spoke of my work or my father's work. But some obligations can't be broken by silence. They persist across generations until they're fulfilled. The scratching you'll hear in the deep tunnels, that's not the thing itself. It's what's left of previous observers who got too close, who stayed too long, who allowed themselves to be absorbed completely. They're not in pain. They're not suffering. They're just changed, simplified, made into tools the thing uses to maintain its environment, to attract new subjects for study. Bill says it's peaceful after the fear passes. Telpy's right. I'm going down tomorrow to retrieve my research files from the deep chamber. I know I won't come back the same, but maybe I'll come back as something that can help, that can guide the next generation when they arrive. Maybe that's what we've always been, not victims, but volunteers who knew the cost and paid it anyway. The compass will bring you home, one way or another. I sat in that basement for hours, reading and rereading journals that explained everything and nothing. The neat handwriting gradually becoming desperate, the scientific observations giving way to something almost like wonder or resignation. My grandfather had known exactly what he was walking into 40 years ago, had chosen it deliberately, accepting a role that had been prepared for him across generations. I found photographs tucked into the back of one journal, pictures of the deep chamber, somehow preserved despite the radiation and time. Its walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reorganize themselves depending on the angle of viewing. And in the center of the chamber, something my eyes couldn't quite process. Not a creature or an object, but a space where reality folded in on itself, creating a presence that existed in more dimensions than human perception could fully grasp. Other photographs showed previous observers. My great-grandfather standing in mining gear, his face already showing the waxy, deteriorated look that Bill had now. Other men I didn't recognize, lined up like a class photo, all of them wearing expressions of calm acceptance, all of them already changing, already being absorbed into something larger than themselves. In one final photograph that made my hand shake, a group of children, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing in front of the mine entrance. The photo was dated 1954, before my mother was born. One of the children had her eyes. We'd been connected to this place for much longer than 1 or 2 generations. This went back to the beginning, to whatever had brought my family to America in the first place. We hadn't fled persecution or sought opportunity. We'd been sent as observers, as witnesses, as volunteers in an experiment that had been running since before recorded history. The thing beneath the mountain had been selecting families for generations, calling them across oceans and continents, arranging their lives so that eventually someone would dig deep enough to find it. And my family had been answering that call for over a century. Each generation contributing their piece to a puzzle that was only now becoming clear. I locked the journals in their filing cabinet and put the key in my pocket. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Bill was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting, protecting the world from something it wasn't ready to understand. Keeping guard over secrets that had killed or changed everyone in my family who tried to learn them. My grandfather's compass sat on my kitchen table, needle pointing steadily southeast toward mountains I never wanted to see again. But I knew I would, eventually. The call was already there, a pressure building at the back of my skull, like the beginning of a migraine. The compass needle trembled, pulling, insistent. I could feel Millbrook, the way you feel a thunderstorm building on the horizon, inevitable, approaching, carrying both destruction and some terrible kind of clarity. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they call to us anyway. And when they do, we answer. 'Cause that's what we've always done. 'Cause that's what we were bred for across generations. 'Cause the thing beneath is patient and hungry and lonely, and it needs us to remember what it was before it went to sleep. A tie just wasn't ready. Not yet, but ready or not, the compass keeps pointing southeast. And eventually, I'll follow.